I was just out last week. I survived Texas. Man, that was brutal. And you said you like Houston. I'm like, I'm sorry, I couldn't find anything I liked about it.
Oh, really? That's okay. That's funny. No, I do like Houston. I like it more than I like Dallas. But then I didn't see much of Dallas's last trip because it was like 110 degrees outside.
Yeah, I know, exactly. So that's why I didn't see much of Houston either. But when you start venturing outside of the city limits, then it's just, yeah, it's just typical sprawling, flat, hot.
Oh, I forgot. You're from San Diego. So the rest of the country looks like a big cornfield to you. I got it. Okay. It's good. It's all good.
I know. We have a tendency to be a little spoiled here. Sorry.
All right. Well, we are at the top of the hour. So I'm going to go ahead and get kicked off. So welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us in our July 22 presentation in our series. My name is Daniel Hodges. I'm president and co-founder of Pieces of Me Foundation. We have been running a series of webinars throughout 2022 addressing various topics and how they relate to disability, because our mission is to erase the stigma surrounding disability and chronic illness, and that only happens through greater awareness and breaking down barriers through better dialogue. So I am grateful to have all of you here. Throughout the evening, we're going to be dropping some links regarding our website and social into the chat, and also encouraging those who are able to access the chat, you can leave comments and questions. We will also be taking questions, time permitting, at the end of the conversation. For those who can't access the chat, you can also come off mute at that point. Karen will give the signal. So with all that said, I would like to introduce our host tonight, our moderator of this discussion, Dr. Karen Schultz. She is the director of the University of Baltimore Office for Disability and Access Services. As a former student of hers, I can testify that she is excellent at her job, pardon me, and that she has a truly remarkable knowledge of the ADA. So I couldn't have asked for a better moderator for this series of discussions regarding the ADA that starts tonight. Dr. Schultz is also one of our founding board members. As a matter of fact, one of the first people that I asked in 2019 to join this movement when we were putting it together. So Karen, again, I'm grateful to have you hosting. I'm grateful for your membership on this team, and I will let you take it away from here.
Hey, thank you, Daniel, for the accolades. I appreciate that. It's always good to hear from someone else because I don't toot my own horn. So having it tooted by someone else is appreciated. So thank you for joining us this evening, everybody. I am very excited about the conversation that we're going to be having regarding the ADA. As some of you may know, the ADA was signed into law 32 years ago on Tuesday, actually. So we're just a couple of days shy of the official anniversary date. And we decided, as Daniel was indicating, to really recognize the impact it has had on those of us with disabilities. And when I say those of us, yes, I live with the disability myself. It is invisible. I'm not shy to share, but it's not relevant at this point for today's conversation. We also decided when looking at this from the ADA impact, the positive impacts, which we know are enormous, but the negative impacts and where it still needs to go. So without further ado, I'd like to at least introduce each of our panelists and let them, if they have anything to say, they can share. But we have a series of questions that we've pulled together that we'd like to have each of them address to their best of their abilities. And then, of course, as Daniel said, sometime during the course of the evening, please feel free to drop questions, commentary in. Hi, Shelby. I know that dog bark. In the chat, because we'll be monitoring that as well. And then we'll save some time towards the end of the evening for hopefully as robust a conversation as we can have, given the time limit that we do have. And to be cognizant of our time limits, We want to try and close as close to 9 o'clock as we can. We have our interpreters till that time, so for the benefit of their sake, as well as anyone else's time, we all have busy people, things to do, places to go. We want to stick to our timeline. So without any further ado, I'm going to start in no particular order. Actually, I'm going to do an alphabetical order by last name. That's the fairest way to go. Christine, if you can please introduce yourself and your title and where you work.
Hi, thank you, Karen. My name is Christine Ericema, and I'm a senior manager of diversity sourcing at Pfizer. I'm based out of the San Diego site, and my job is to directly impact the population of talent with disabilities, veterans, and LGBTQ+. And so my job is specifically to build the strategy for disability inclusion for Pfizer, even though we have been part of some organizations to help us with that effort. We're now moving towards more accountability from the senior and the enterprise level. So they've asked me to put together a strategy. So that includes what's happening with our structure and inclusivity for people with disabilities. Also our sourcing, looking for partners that are willing to work with us to help to shape our strategy, but also to help us find talent with disabilities that we can bring to Pfizer across all of our different parts of the organization, and also the recruiting and hiring aspect of it, looking at the entire talent recruitment lifecycle and looking for areas where we can modify it so that they're very inclusive to people with disabilities, candidates and colleagues. So I've been with Pfizer for 25 years. Prior to this role, which I started just only about 3 weeks ago, I was a scientist, more specifically analytical chemist, working in our early discovery medicinal chemistry department. I ran a purification group, and I operated a lab, and I led global projects. So I've been able to experiment on where I wanted to make the most impact. And of course, as a person with disability, I'm deaf, and I always went back to, I wanted to be in a role where I could make the most impact and leverage my passion and my lived experience as a person with disabilities to make a difference in our company. So I took this job.
And we're very happy and thankful of having you here tonight to share your experiences. Our next presenter, panelist, again in alphabetical order, is Professor Michael Hayes.
Oh, thank God.
Oh, hi. Thank you, Karen. And I was practicing. That's a very tough panelist to follow, and I'm very impressed. But
Thank you.
I was practicing when the ADA was passed, and we did some work with it. But then I started teaching it in 1996. So I've been involved with it for quite a long time. I am a professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law, and I'll just end by attesting to the excellence of Karen Schultz, who has helped me and my students many times. So thank you, Karen.
Thank you again. Appreciate that. One of our other panelists is one of our board members as well, Mr. Gary Horton.
Like Dr. Hayes, I was sitting here thinking that I wish my last name was Z, so I didn't have to follow Erigema. My name is Gary Horton. I am the president and CEO of Vanward Consulting Services. We operate in two spheres, one in the private sector, the other in the public sector. We do programs for the specifically the visually impaired, all around employment and staffing and training. On the private side of the business, we do energy consulting, automotive consulting, project management, those types of things. I'm very eager and anxious to get into this conversation, and I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you.
Okay, thank you, Gary. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Andy Imparato.
Thanks, Karen. Is my audio coming through okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Well, it's great to be here with you. It's nice to see all these University of Baltimore folks. I lived in Baltimore for 26 years, and my wife was a history professor at the University of Baltimore. So it's great to be with you all. I worked in DC for all of that time, including as Senator Tom Harkin's Disability Policy Director when he was the chair of the U.S. Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. So I'm trained as a lawyer. I'm a policy wonk, and I'm currently the executive director of Disability Rights California, which is a federally funded protection and advocacy agency for people with all types of disabilities across the state of California. So because the funding is based on the population of the state, we're the biggest protection and advocacy agency. We have a $41 million budget, about 330 staff, and I'm based in Sacramento, and I have lived experience with bipolar disorder, which I've been open about throughout my career.
Okay, thank you. Esteemed panelists, excited to hear from you this evening. So going to the questions that we shared with our panelists ahead of time, so they had a little more time to prep their response and experiences. These are the questions we want to kind of focus our conversation on in regards to the American with Disabilities Act. How did it help and how did it hurt? And we're taking it from an employment perspective this month, because that was the one that we decided would be a good starting point, because there's a lot of stuff people don't understand about the ADA and what they think they understand about the ADA and its application from the employment sector. What we don't want this to be this evening, though, is a lecture. So the professors in the house, the instructors in the house will watch that. We really want this to be a learning experience and an interactive process for people to really walk away with some information they may have not had before. And for those of you who are experienced in this area, please feel free to share your information as well, because again, what we learn from each other only helps build what we're doing as a mission for Pieces of Me. With that said, I'm going to go in order of the questions because I'm a nerd. I like going in the order of things as they're presented to me. The first question we posed to our panelists was, how can we encourage employers to actively participate in the creation of jobs with the concept of universal design in mind? And so I'm going to throw this out to anybody who wants to start with the answers, and any questions we have. Universal design is something that we can talk about from an employment perspective as well as an educational perspective. But again, we're kind of focusing on employment. So anybody?
Well, I'm not shy. So being the person that is not in education and not a scientist, just a geek, I would say the following, a blind person. I think the concept of intelligent design is critical, and I think it will become accelerated with employment. I kind of think of it in my way of thinking, from my perspective, as the cart before the horse. That is to say that more people with so-called disabilities that are engaged in businesses, particularly in corporate America, it will drive business to see the value of engaging. If you look at it the other way, it becomes a bit of capital investment. And that's always a difficult lift for corporations. And I believe that as an individual seeking employment with corporations, I have to position myself best by doing whatever it takes to indicate that I'm prepared for these positions. So that is not a popular attitude, but I do believe it is one that is effective.
If I might interject, I think that was very useful, and it got me to thinking, because one of the things I was saying, how has it hurt? And one of the problems is things get put in boxes. And what Gary Horton just mentioned, the capital investment, of course, in the ADA box is reasonable accommodation and undue hardship. And employer lawyers, we paid a lot to say universal design is an undue hardship. And so from the legal point of view, that has to be resisted. So I just wanted to point that out, and as he said, by showing how it actually provides value, that should be subtracted from whatever the cost of capital investment, and the more employers who are doing it, the more evidence will be for that.
Exactly right. That's what I feel. I think that moves the ball most aggressively. I think it's going to happen eventually, because technology in and of itself, and people with the resilience to go after these jobs, myself included, and working with corporations that are open to the concept, met a lot of them last week. that will push the ball. But if we start off by saying this is a capital investment to help those with disabilities without the awareness coming up front, without the advocacy coming up front, I think there'll be resistance like there always is with corporations.
So if I may add, so from an industry perspective, so we, even though as a very large company, Pfizer had made some strides in trying to become a little bit more accessible, or even just creating more visibility around the accommodation and accessibility processes. I do know that we still have a tendency to become very reactive, versus proactive. So in other words, if somebody comes to the company or somebody within the company ends up with a disability and needs accommodation, then we have to react and try to figure out what needs to be done, what the person needs. So the concept of universal design, I think the key thing to do is, first, you need to make sure that there is a centrally managed, centrally funded accessibility and accommodation hub for the company. So anybody across the globe can just request it rather than have to deal with all of the little bit of a red tape, if you will, because in my perspective, the ADA's definition of reasonable accommodation hasn't exactly been very friendly to me because for instance, like when I was in college, and the ADA passing was still relatively new. And so I went to a large university in Pennsylvania. I went to Penn State University. And the reason why I went there was because they promised to, they had an office for students dedicated for students with disabilities. So they promised to provide me accommodations I need, like note takers and things like that. So I said, great, I ended up leaving the state and going 400 miles away from home, and going to a very large university. And when I walked into the office and I asked for note takers for my classes, they said, well, what we can do is we don't have note takers per se, but what we can offer you is here's a book of carbon paper. So you can take a sheet of carbon paper and give it to the person in your classroom. And I'm talking like 500 people in the room. Who do I pick? Give them a piece of carbon paper, let them take the notes, and then they can give you the copy so that you can use that. So I think, okay, that's bogus.
Exactly.
But you know what? At that time, I was too embarrassed, and I was not going to admit that I chose the wrong school. So I stuck it out, and it wasn't easy. So having to rely on my own reading and rely on very badly written notes. So that was really terrible. So, and another thing is now with all of the advancements in technology, and I'm very, very dependent on closed captioning. So some of these virtual platforms starting to have built-in artificial intelligence in it. So we have captioning here, as opposed to having the accommodation for a third-party real-life captioning captioner. So I use both. For years, I've used a real person, whether it's in person or on the phone. And the accuracy was, it was fair depending on the content and the person's actual preparation in advance of the meeting with getting the words in their dictionary or however else they do it. But then now, when I ask for, I have to still specifically ask for somebody who's setting up a meeting or an event or even a company-wide town hall. I still have to ask for closed captioning, and they're saying, well, we provide artificial intelligence. We can just turn it on for you. And I'm like, okay, so that's so it's still an ongoing thing. So the reasonable accommodation definition doesn't always meet. But anyway, my point with the UDL definition is we need to have a centrally managed accommodation and accessibility hub that allows us to get the quality, high quality accommodation that we need, not just the bare minimum that's reasonable.
And
Andy?
this is Andy. I guess all I would add, just going back to the question of what will it take to get employers to embrace universal design? I think for some employers, it's going to require a strong business case, the business value of universal design, helping them understand what universal design is, how it doesn't just help people with disabilities as employees or customers, but it helps everybody in the workplace, and it can lead to innovations that help everybody. I think if you look at what happened during COVID, lots of employers learned how to do remote work for lots of different types of jobs that they thought could not be done remotely. So everybody had to innovate quickly. The employers that were best prepared for that innovation were employers that had lots of people already working remotely. And you could say having a flexible remote work policy was an example of universal design that some employers adopted long before COVID, but many had to learn on the fly with COVID. So I feel like our strongest case for some employers is going to be the business case. I think for some employers, it's going to be a culture thing. And this is where I agree with Gary that having more folks with disabilities all over the company, including people who are out and proud with non-visible disabilities, is going to create a culture where it's harder for an employer to ignore the benefits of accessibility and universal design. So
Hallelujah, praise the Lord.
Yeah, so I don't know that there's one answer to that question, but what I don't think is going to get us to universal design is the ADA. The ADA is not a law that forces employers to do universal design, and unfortunately, most employers do the bare minimum that they're required to do under the ADA. And I think Christine's, example is a good one. And we have to help employers get out of that mindset. We have to help them believe that learning how to do universal design is going to make them more successful as a company. And it's not about complying with whatever the bare minimum is that's required by federal law.
I would just nudge a little bit. I would argue that Christine, if we can speak about her in the room, proves 2 points. That companies can put key people in roles that can really have an impact. I think when I think about the ADA, when we talked about this, I think of it in this context. I'm 62 years old. I have benefited from the landmark legislation in 1964 and 1965 and what came after it. But I also was hurt by it. What really changed the game, though, what absolutely changed it is the individuals inside those institutions making way, opening doors. And I think with technology, that's fueled even faster. I would just say the following. We have a social upheaval, right? We have an economic challenge. We haven't had this kind of employers looking for employees since the 80s, late 80s, early 90s maybe, right? So we have an opportunity where employers need people. Technology is surging, and the millennials are buying based on what a company does, not what a company says. If we lean into this, in my opinion, more people like Christine end up in those positions, right? There's more Gary Hortons that become presidents of their own companies. There are nonprofits that encourage the people, the students, the people that have the disabilities to not hide in the shadows, but to be out front about it and understand if we're 5th of this country or 15th of this country, or whatever the number is, that is true buying power. And that's what corporations listen to. And when it becomes that, corporations will hit the accelerator. So what I'm attempting to do and what I am advocating for and what I'm pushing for is more of us to get out there and push, do those jobs, push past the disability, say what you can do and be excellent at it. That is what's going to open these doors up. That's what's going to make corporations turn around. And that's the space in which I want to play. Does that make sense?
100%. And it kind of leads us into the next question that I presented to them. So thank you, Gary, for that beautiful segue. How can we encourage folks, people with disabilities, to take a more active role in engaging potential employers? And we started touching upon this, but we can expand on what you've experienced, what your thoughts are, because again, the leading of the way probably needs to be those who need to show why it needs to be done, as opposed to just doing the bare minimum, which a lot of employers think, well, we've got a curb cuts, we've got automatic door openers, I've got Braille and certain signage. What else do you need?
So this is Andy. I'm happy to go first on this one. I guess one issue that I would bring up is the importance of disability pride and disability identity development. If you want people with disabilities to be comfortable engaging with employers as candidates, people with disabilities need to be comfortable putting it out there during the hiring process. They need to be comfortable talking about what they might need in the way of accommodations at work. And from a strategy standpoint, I acquired my disability. My first serious episode of depression was when I was in law school. And my orientation to my new status came from medical practitioners who hadn't really been exposed to a civil rights frame or a social frame of disability. So if you think about who's teaching people about their identities as people with disabilities, it's often a medical doctor who hasn't had it as part of their professional training to help people develop pride in their identity and to help people learn how to navigate their identity as part of who they are and as something that can be a positive differentiator when you're looking for a job. So I feel like that is a piece of it. That, you know, the person who's the head of the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research right now at the Department of Health and Human Services, Anjali Forber-Pratt, her research is about disability identity development. She does it in the context of vocational rehabilitation. And her theory is that one of the skills that vocational rehabilitation counselors need to get better at is assessing where somebody is in their own journey as a person with a disability and whether they're comfortable talking about their disability and asking for things that they might need at work. So I feel like that's a piece of it that doesn't always get attention.
That's a very good point. And I'm sorry to do two lawyers back to back, but there's a number of points that I wanted to respond to with that. As I tell my employment law, I think it's, you know, you do have to be upfront and all that, but with the caveat that you got to do it carefully, because I tell my employment law course, and most applicants don't get jobs, they're not told why. They just said you didn't get the job. So you have to be, you know, and I'm also reacting to some of the chat where they said, you know, accommodations, you can be proactive and say the only accommodation I would need is X or Y or Z, and you have already done some design depending on what kind of company it is. Again, ADA covers everybody, every employer with 15 or more employees, so this includes some small employers. But you know, you just have to be, you know, you might ask if you're going to say that, no matter what state you're in, what can I record this part? And things like that. And then, you know, if they react very negatively to that, you kind of know what's going on. So by all means, you know, be brave. And this is a good time to be brave because people need workers, but you might want to, you know, as we always say, document everything. And when they tell you, if you do get rejected for the job, make them tell you why. And if it doesn't seem plausible, then there could be a concern there.
You know, maybe I come at this a little bit different, not significantly differently, but maybe I come at this a little bit differently. Like I said, you know, the first 55 years of my life, I was African-American male with vision, albeit low vision, it was vision nonetheless. And there are jobs that I had interviewed for that I did not get. And I would say in my heart of hearts, in some of those situations, I think the race was involved. So I guess what I would argue and what I want to put on the table is there always is risk when you're trying to be employed in that context. In the context of being employed, there's always risk of bias on the other person's side, regardless of your disability. I would just say that, I've dealt with what I believe to be bias in employment my entire employed life, which is why I became an entrepreneur, right? I'm not biased against myself. That's where I have control. That being said, I never not talked about my African-Americanness or my Blackness, because it is part of my, it's part of who I am. It's part of my identity. And I think now that I'm blind completely, that also is part of my identity. Lastly, my search for excellence is also part of my identity. And I lead with that card when I'm in any interview. I lead with my excellence, my knowledge, my capability, my ability to work around corners, my ability to leverage technology to get a job done. And if they see the value, I think accommodations becomes an easier conversation. But it should not be hidden. It should not be hidden, because at the end of the day, the employer is going to know. And then they'll really be PO'd, I would argue. That's just my opinion.
Giovanni still reeling under the last messages he received from his son.
Okay, if we can ask anyone who's not on the panel to make sure you're muted this evening, so we have no feedback against us. And Christy, it looks like you have an input.
Yeah, I was trying to say something. Is there somebody else trying to talk?
Nope, your turn.
Okay, so at Pfizer, we recently had a round of a self-identification campaign for disabilities, and as expected, was definitely underreported. So although I have to say that between the last time we did it, which was probably about 3 years ago, we actually doubled the number of people who actually self-identified as having a disability. But still, I know those numbers are really, really low. So, what I would encourage people to do is really, really think about their disability. And a lot of people are shaped by the biases and the discrimination and the stereotypes associated with disability. That's disability being weak. And what I tell them is, look, you're not the only one who has a disability. And there's no shame in having a disability. It's actually not a weakness, but it's really a badge of honor, because that makes you unique. And it makes you who you are. It's just who you are. So, but I tried to explain to them that if you want to be the authentic person, Pfizer encourages people to bring 100% of their authentic self to work every day. I said the only way you're going to do that is to really just do yourself a favor and self-identify, because once you self-identify, you can go through the appropriate channels and go through and getting accommodations that you may need or may not need now, but maybe later. But also, I think that there's self-identification. The more people that self-identify, and it goes back to the business case that Andy was talking about. The business case for getting universal design is really depending on, we're not just creating universal design practices for 250 people in a 40,000 member company. So I want to make sure that we increase the number of people who will self-identify and tell them that even if it's not for yourself, do it for others, because you're paving the way for others and making it easier for others to be able to get, have an environment that's built in universally designed principles, and it also has a very robust repertoire of accommodations or accessibility tools, digital tools that they may need. So that's my opinion.
That's the civil rights approach I can get behind. It's when people identify, it's bigger numbers have larger impacts. I think that's the direction. It's got to be that type of movement, but it starts out with the pioneers, the people that go into the teeth of the defense, so to say, into the lion's den, and they do battle and they reach back and help others. That's why I work in this space, because I think we have an opportunity, and it won't exist forever. The economy is going to make its turn, and the employers are going to be back on top, and we're going to be killing each other for these jobs. Right now, we can, if we lean into it, we can get those positions. As I say, when you're sitting across the table from Christine or Gemma and you see that she is clearly has a so-called disability, it does make you feel better about the company you're dealing with, and it does make you feel braver to engage, right? When we have people inside the company that are asking the questions about whether a person needs an accommodation because they know that they need them themselves, that is what's going to change the game. It changed it with LGBT marriage, in my opinion. It happened when the corporations got behind it and saw the value in it. So one last thing, I don't want us to go right past the VR piece that was mentioned earlier, because I do think that is a critical piece in how the people within the program, what is considered job readiness for them. The resilience piece and the self-advocacy piece and the disclosure piece is part of it for job readiness. Now, for loving yourself, that might be a different thing. Everybody has to keep their privacy private. I get that. But if we're talking about the employment space in a real sense, you have to show up, the total person, and you have to deliver some goods. That's what gets people employed, and that's how people stay employed. So it's got to be the resilience part. It's got to be the part that says you have to stand up. Same thing with African Americans. You just can't get a Pell Grant and be given a job in affirmative action and then suck. You have to show up and do the work. And to the extent that you do, you dispel those stereotypes. That's, I mean, that's my approach. That's what I don't want us to keep the VR out of it, because some of this language does come from rehab, and we gotta, realign that with real employment outcomes and lessons that work with the people that are in rehab. That may be controversial, but it's true.
Karen, this is Andy. I wanted to just mention some other benefits to self-identification beyond simply if you need an accommodation, because I think sometimes people assume the main reason to self-identify is if you need an accommodation. But to me, it can also help you connect with other employees, including senior employees that can help you with your career. It can help the company go after the disability community as a market and have insights into the market.
Excellent.
So I just think it's important to recognize some people may not need an accommodation, but they can still benefit from being out at work.
1000%. I agree. Well said.
If we
I
can
agree
kind of
too.
move away from the actual question, the next set of questions, because you opened up good information regarding this disclosure piece of people with disabilities and employment. And I think as someone who's worked in higher education for nearly 30 years, and the majority of that time has been in support of students with disabilities, that's a hard piece for a lot of our students to take on themselves. But it's in a different environment. It's a little more protected because they're there because they want to get the education. There's no fear being fired per se, as there would be an employee when they have to disclose something that they feel could be held against them, or looked upon as we talked about already, lesser than maybe their peers who are employed in the same company. Can any of you address how we help people with disabilities who don't know that, as Andy said, disclosure for the sake of disclosure, not necessarily for accommodations, to broaden that group of supports, or at least have a better understanding that we're all in this together? Can you address that? Anybody?
I want to give Christine a shot in case she was.
So the caption.
It's easy for me to talk. I have an opinion about everything.
I know you do, Gary.
Well,
So
I mean, Karen, I think you almost answered the question in the question, right? The more people that self-identify and disclose, the other people that will be open to doing so. I would say in the state of Michigan, even at least, that we have people in the state of Michigan that understands that this message has to start from high school. It can't start when you're knocking on doors and looking for a job. And I think it is too late, not too late, but it's not as effective even when you're in college pursuing your education. It has to start in that pre-ETS time, that 14 to 16, when you're making the first decisions about who you're going to be, what you're going to be, what your options are. And in that space, it can't just be platitudes. I think the way to do it in my opinion, is when you engage people with so-called disabilities with people with so-called disabilities in that education sense. Not hoarded together and all being taught in that paternal approach, but authority figures doing the lessons, authority figures talking about what the real world is. That will strengthen these students, open the aperture, give them opportunities. So when they get to that college area, when they get to that college piece, they're not fearful of disclosing. When you go to an employer, the number one, one of the most important things is straight up confidence. I'm blind as a bat. I cannot see the screen. But when I walk in a room, no one misunderstands that I'm a knowledgeable, prepared, well-practiced, professional person. I had to do it when I was an African-American. I have to do it as a blind man. That is the fact. That is reality. And that's what I deal with on a day-to-day basis. So to your point, the way to get people to feel more comfortable about disclosing is to start to work that confidence even while they're still in high school, in college, because they've just been ignored. Not completely, right? There's nothing completely, but I say to a large extent, they are ignored. Like Christine said, use the carbon paper, you'll be fine, right? You have to come up with your own solutions, and you have to have other people, individuals that are willing to engage, to assist as you go forward. That's all, and that's what I would say. I hope that at least answers your question, Karen. Did I go off on a tangent?
Nope.
But I'm going to throw my soapbox away.
No, that's my job, Gary. I'm the one that goes off on a tangent, but I can add to that. So I can add to that. So, you know, as a corporation, you know, we're always trying to remain competitive, especially in the industry that I'm in. So when we want to attract talent to our company, we want those talent who, like Gary said, who have disclosed and they're very open about it. They want to be able to come to a company that has the culture that is a fit for them and that they feel like they could thrive in it. They'll feel comfortable, confident, and they can do and be authentic every day. But if it's so having that, the leadership needs to step down, take the initiative and make sure that they have accountability built into their enterprise goal, saying that this is something that we're going to do. We need to have that we're going to be committing to disability inclusion, because right now they're asking us to self-identify, but we're not seeing a whole lot of you know, motivational or inspirational. I mean, we saw a few, but none of them from senior leadership. So how many of our executive leaders in my company actually have a lived experience with a disability? I don't even know that question, and neither do a lot of my colleagues. So if you don't promote that, then why should people want to come to our company? So that's the message that I've been trying to tell my department and even the senior leaders, that as part of building a foundation that those students want to come to maintain our competitiveness compared to companies like Merck or Johnson & Johnson or BMS, Glaxo. Those are our competitors. So if we're going to compete with them, we got to do better than them when it comes to making it comfortable for people to self-identify.
Thank you for that. I just want to turn the tables on Karen. You speak at orientation, don't you? Or law school? Oh, you don't? Oh, I thought
No,
we had added
my
that.
colleagues in the Office of Academic Affairs do most of that presentation about Office of Disability and Access Services. So we kind of provide the script and they take it on because we do a joint partnership with them for the logistics of implementation of accommodations.
Okay, thank you.
Just one thing to lift up, Karen, and I'm sure you know this. Some institutions of higher ed have changed the name of that kind of an office and have called it something like a disability cultural center. And one of the things that I like about that framing is it's not just about accommodations, it's a place where you can come to connect with the culture of disability and all the ways that it touches the campus, including in the arts, in sports, in, you know, in different parts of the academic mission of the campus. So I think to the extent that lots of people get in touch with their own identities, multiple identities, as part of higher education, there is an opportunity for higher ed to think about disability, again, not just about complying with whatever laws require certain types of accessibility or accommodations, but really helping people get in touch with the fact that this is a culture that they're part of, that any student can join at any time, and, you know, kind of different ways to access the culture, understand the culture, and understand the history of, you know, our country and the world's treatment of people with disabilities. So I think if you can frame that mission more broadly, tie it in more nuanced ways to the academic mission, that can also help people leave the campus with a stronger cultural identity.
I love that. That's my takeaway from this meeting. I love that.
Yeah,
I
mine
love
too.
what you just said, that bifurcation of students and then those with so-called disabilities. And I've heard this story a million times, sometimes in these meetings, of the isolation that exists, the not belonging. If you talk to anybody that went away to school, I'm a city school guy. So like my wife, anybody that's going away to school, that experience is meeting other people, joining sororities and or fraternities, meeting people that are friends for the rest of your life, but you have a common interest. But I don't hear that narrative as often with those with disabilities. I like that concept of disability culture. That is outstanding. I haven't encountered any of the schools that I've spoken to that define an office that way, but if that's a movement, man, I'm totally behind it.
Yeah, Deborah Vick just mentioned in the chat the University of Arizona, which is a good example of a university that frames it broadly and has they have a good budget for it, and they also have one of the best inclusive sports programs in the country, which is connected to that office.
Outstanding.
Yeah, and the director of their office is now the outgoing president of our national organization, of our head of National Association of Higher Education and Disabilities. I also want to mention, just for the sake of the cultural component of this, the University of Baltimore School of Law has, I think it's been 2 years growing, a National Disabled Law Student Association chapter that has been not just vocal about changes that need to be made, but it's bringing about the idea of culture, that this is a group of folks who share the commonality of having a diagnosis that impacts them as a student. And they are working diligently to bring this out to the forefront, because professional school, you know, the next step is going into the practice, as opposed to an undergrad. Maybe that's not the next step immediately. So it's a great chapter. They've done a lot of good work. Our former president just finished taking her bar this week. So it's cool to watch the transition of the mindset, the paradigm shift that's happening. Okay. On to our next question, folks. What updates or reform do you think the ADA would make the ADA more impactful or better understood by employers and employees?
Well, personally, as I mentioned before, I think that the definition of reasonable accommodation, I think it makes people feel that they can provide the bare minimum of accommodation. So that means, to me, in my mind, cheap accommodations. Regardless of quality. And so I think that there is room for improvement in reframing the definition of the ADA to make sure that people with disabilities have access to the best accommodation that they need to make sure that they have the same experiences, equitable experiences like somebody else in their company. So for instance, somebody in the meeting will be able to hear everything somebody said, and they're this really amazing lecture, and they caught everything, 100% of everything that was being said. Somebody with a disability has to rely on artificial intelligence in the caption. So with the accuracy, not the best. So maybe the person with a disability would miss about maybe 75, maybe 30% of it, 40%. I just missed. So that's not an equitable experience. So reasonable accommodation should be providing the best accommodation that the person with the disability can use to make sure that they can compete with their colleagues, and also it's just equitable. It makes business sense.
I just want to interject quickly because, we know what Congress is like and we know what the federal courts are like, and even the state courts in Maryland, at least the appellate courts and many places around the country. And of course, national, federal would be the most ideal. And maybe Andy will want to comment on this because California certainly has done a lot. But it has a non-supremacy provision in it. And so states can pass things, localities can pass things, counties can pass things. And so you could completely rewrite it and say, we're not even going to call it reasonable accommodation, we're called best accommodation. You can do whatever you want. So I did want to make that point. It is not precluded.
Yeah, but I still go to your point. Your point is well taken. I mean, the way that the things are set up now, Congress is completely broken, more so than any time in my lifetime, and I'm 62 years old. With respect to the question, I would say eliminate across the entire country the sub-minimum wage is a travesty. It doesn't accomplish anything. If anything, it makes people with disabilities feel like they're less, not more. It is a deplorable practice. And I think I read something recently that the Biden administration is trying to do something about it. But if there's one change that I believe should be made to the ADA and all the other paragraphs, you guys are the lawyers, you know more than I know, but that is so soul crushing and killing. It should be eliminated immediately, because that is the paternalistic attitude that drives the biases that exist, right? And I think that needs to be completely stricken. If there's anything that we can all get behind, let's get behind that. And the whole structure of these organizations that hire people with disabilities so they can underpay them to do services for the government that gives billions of dollars to the defense industry is just a travesty. So I'm very passionate about that. I should be paid what I'm worth, and what I'm worth is between my two ears.
But I think that you can, just like Michael said, you can change that. The state can make those changes. They can make changes to the sub-minimum wage. And I think there are some states
means
that
they
are
can
on that
keep it too,
bandwagon. They
but-
are making change.
Yeah, it means they can keep it too. If we play that state game, this patchwork of states, I mean, remember, Jim Crow was passing laws in some states and not passing laws in other. I do not support that approach. As a person with disabilities, I should be able to be in any state in the United States of America and have the same basic rights. I hear you, Christine, and that may be a first step. But the question was, what would I do? I would strike it, not have states have to approve it, because that, again, our legislatures are broken. We've been managing by executive order. I'm not trying to make this political, but for the love of God, it should be stricken. It's a soul-sucking thing that will never allow people with disabilities to develop the resilience and the self-love and the focus to achieve that is required to turn this thing around. That's what I say, for whatever it's worth.
So I agree with Gary that we need to do it at the federal level, and there's an effort to do that. I also think it's helpful that California and a bunch of other states have done it at the state level, because it makes it easier. There's a momentum that comes out of that.
Agreed.
It makes it easier to get it done at the federal level. But going back to Michael's point, we are working in California on what we're calling a Californians with Disabilities Act, which is an effort to modernize the requirements in the ADA to reflect all the changes that have happened in society and what's possible, 32 years later. And we don't know where that bill ultimately is going to land, but we see it as a good organizing tool to remind our policymakers in California and the public of all of the ways that people with disabilities are still discriminated against. A lot of people think that we have the ADA, what else, what more do we need? And the ADA was the result of lots of compromises that people thought, like my former boss, Senator Harkin, they thought were necessary in order to get the law passed in 1990. Well, the world has changed a lot since then. Hopefully the disability community has more power, more political connections, more alliances, that we can get a stronger law. So we want to try to have California start by defining what civil rights should look like, and then use that to build momentum for a stronger federal law. So I think you're right, Michael, that it's easier to start in the states. The first disability rights laws were state laws before we got the ADA. So I think it's a good strategy. Karen, you asked specifically, what are some things that we would change? We need clarity about the fact that people deserve to have equal access to the internet and to all of the things that are empowered by the internet. The courts have not been clear on that. There's been a lot of efforts over the years to get more clarity at the federal level, but that is a big gap. I think Christine hit on another big gap, which is there are large populations within the disability community that need accommodations that most courts would not define as reasonable. So I think one of the mistakes that we made in the ADA is we wrote a law that was a non-discrimination law that treated the disability community as kind of a monolith, one large community.
Bingo.
I don't think we thought hard enough about,
Exactly
okay,
right.
but what about people with intellectual disabilities who might need a job coach? Is that a reasonable accommodation? When is that a reasonable accommodation? Is there a way to have Pat Wright at the Disability Rights Education Defense Fund, who was one of the leaders that worked on the ADA, she used to argue that we should have a fund administered by vocational rehabilitation to pay for unreasonable accommodations. But her concept was there should be support for things that cost a lot of money that employers may not be able to afford, especially small businesses. So whatever we do, when we think about modernizing the ADA, we should think about which subpopulations within the disability community have benefited the least from the ADA, and what can we do to bring them into the protections and have them feel the effect of the law in a deeper way.
As I was sitting here, I was thinking to myself, and it dovetails into what you just said. Maybe work it the equation, maybe work it from the other side, as you were alluding to. What about a moonshot type approach to it? And again, the rehab community in the way they're structured now, facilitating those funds, I don't know if I would support without a different structure within that community. The first community that needs to probably have more people with disabilities engaged, and they do. I know a lot of people with disabilities that work for the state organizations, but they need to have more more power in those organizations, and they need to allocate those funds in a more appreciable way, right? It is really difficult for a person with disabilities to afford the type of technology and accommodations to make things easy, right? I'm when I lost my vision, I was employed within 90 days. I think my file was stayed open for 2 years, but I didn't use much of it because I had the means to purchase a type of equipment to make my life a lot easier. So what changes things, what brings the cost down is when government invests in the tools. I think the model now is they give the states money and they say, get these people employed, you figure it out. But what they're not doing, they're not connected to, they're not aligned with, they don't work as directly with corporate America and what corporate America's needs are. If there is a connection between what corporate America needs and what the Bureau, whatever the Bureau might be, the entire rehab community supplies, you're going to get more marriages. I just think they're not talking to each other right now. Right? So we have to, I'm saying a moonshot, let's get business people around solutions financed by the government at a lower price for people to avail themselves of it, to be better prepared to do the work that the companies actually need. You cannot have corporations out of the mix, and you got to have them pulling in the direction you want to move rather than telling them, wagging your fingers at them and say, this is what you must do. It's the second you do that with a company or corporation or any of these organizations, the first thing they try to figure out is what's the least we can do and how can we avoid it? And they can probably afford, more expensive lawyers on their side. At least that's been my experience while I've been in this space. I think money should be invested. I just don't know that it should be invested in the rehab communities. I think it's got to be invested around solutions that align individuals with employment. That's how you get that done, in my opinion. Maybe I'm just pipe dreaming.
But Gary, if I could just kind of pick up on your theme there, vocational rehabilitation needs to be repurposed. You know, the concept of vocational, to me, connotes low expectations.
Yep.
And the concept of rehabilitation connotes that everybody had some skill that they lost and they're trying to get it back, which is not true of lots of people with disabilities.
Oh, well said. Goodness gracious.
Skills. So to me, why not call it disability employment services and supports, or something where it's clear that their vocational rehabilitation, as we know it now, could have a much clearer concept that a big part of their mission is to serve employers. Yes, to serve corporations, as Gary said, but to serve all employers, including small businesses, and to listen to the employers as much as they listen to their clients with disabilities.
Exactly.
In terms of where they should put their resources and how they should design their business model.
Oh man, I got to get your information. We are on the same page, brother. You and I are on the same page. 100%. I thought this was going to be heated debate and they were going to be throwing things and people would be spitting, but this is great. No, I'm in total agreement with you. I think that changing the now, if you look at the charters of these state organizations, they're saying what you're saying. They're charging their people with getting more employment outcomes. But I like the changing of the name of the organization to say, this is what we're doing and this is why we exist. And what it also changes, if we really go down this road of solutions, it changes the type of individuals that get employed, right? It maybe not be, all due respect, people with master's degrees in rehab. It might be people with business degrees, or alternatively, individuals with experience in the corporate space. So the programs that are constructed are designed in such a way that they help employers. I'll just cite one example in my own life. I attended Wayne State University. I worked at General Motors Corporation. Wayne State University built its IT curriculum around the needs of General Motors information technology, right? So there's a pipeline of people coming out of the schools into business. LTU, Lawrence Technological University, they and working with Ford Motor Company. Ford Motor Company plucked some of those kids right out of those programs into their organizations. Now, those are big corporations, but that can be done on a medium and small level if you have different types of individuals within those state organizations. Now, that is a potential solution, right? That's a potential thing, and it can be done. This is all state legislation that defines what employees are in the state organizations. Is that not true, attorneys?
The federal law says something about requirements for vocational rehabilitation counselors, Gary, and when we updated the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act in 2013, we made the qualifications looser for exactly the reasons that you're describing, and the vocational rehabilitation field hated it.
Of course they did.
But the current law is much more open in terms of the qualifications that people can have and work in vocational rehabilitation.
I get that. I get that. Yeah,
I really like this conversation. I really like Andy's mentioning of unreasonable accommodation and the fact that we need to change vocational rehabilitation. That's so outdated. I'm totally 100% in agreement with that.
Yeah.
If I may just interject with something that we just talked about before about changing the ADA at the federal level. I agree, eventually it does need to be done, and I'm all in. I'm sorry, Gary, please don't throw anything at me. I think it needs to be done at a state level to start with, because if you start implementing the grand scheme of things, on the federal level, I'm worried that they would put a lot of talent with disability that a significant disadvantage the company. They're not going to want to hire them. So that's just, I don't know if this is just my thought, if anybody else has anything around that, but if they do something like that, then they would have to raise the minimum for the if you are a federal contractor, instead of having 7% unemployed, you need to raise that. So I think that's why 7% just seems so small to me.
Yeah, I mean, no spitting or hitting. I'll be a good boy. But here's what I'm going for here. Because of the major factors of virtual work, which I have to let us all agree that is clearly not going away. Virtual work is rechanging the workplace, and we have to reimagine what states can and cannot do and what power they do or do have over employees. I sit here in Michigan, but I have clients I work with in the Baltimore area, in New York, California, out there where you live. So, you know, the problem is where people are landlocked into positions that have to be in those states. And that what I'm saying is then you have to be in a state where those laws are to your favor. I mean, if you live out, I can't move to California. My salary is not worth in California what it is here in Michigan, right? So if we're now talking about a sub-minimum wage, I'm glad that it was done out in California, but even that is not going to allow somebody that's doing a sub-minimum wage in Michigan to relocate to California just to have access to that right. What I'm trying to say is there are federal installations around this entire country, definitely in Michigan, right? And all I'm saying is there's a lot of dollars around these companies that supply these resources to the federal government, because they're the ones largely taking advantage of this sub-minimum wage workforce, right? They're saying, we're giving you a contract, but you have a sub-minimum wage, we pay you at piece price, and you do this work for us, thus employing the people with disabilities, so everybody's happy, right? No, because the people that are doing the work are not independent, which is really the job, it's the mission of these state organizations.
Yeah, just very quickly, that's what the Department of Labor is working on, is the federal contractors, the U.S. Department of Labor. And at least for people already working for the federal contractors, to address your point, Christy, their pay would just go up. I think they couldn't turn around and then just fire them. I think over time, it is something to be watched. Are they relying less on disabled, and is that going to be a problem? So I think there's validity of both points with the Department of Labor. Meanwhile, they'll be challenged in federal court, and they'll take it to a Trump judge, and they'll issue a nationwide injunction against it. But that's neither here nor there. That's the problem with the federal. I agree 100%. The ideal is the federal, the ideal is the national, but that's the country we live in now. So,
yeah, I agree. I agree with that. And again, I'm persuaded by your argument. There's always steps to take, even in the civil rights movement, which I sit here today a beneficiary of, right? I benefited from that. So that being said, my dream is to do it federally, but yes, some movement is better than no movement. Let's be clear about that. So let's all agree on that. No spitting.
And Michael, I just want to say, and I know you know this, it's not just Trump judges. I mean, if you look at the history of Supreme Court interpretation of the ADA and the Constitution as it applies to people with disabilities, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was not great.
Not on this.
So it's not just Trump judges. We have had a hard time finding Supreme Court justices who truly understand what civil and human rights mean for people with disabilities. So we have a lot of work to do to even convince the quote unquote progressive justices how they should rule on in these disability cases.
I can tag on to that and just kind of segue into one of the other questions, because I think it's a good connection. Is we're talking about making things overall more awareness, acceptance, etc. one of the questions is how businesses, we can help them to review greater accessibility as an opportunity rather than an obligation or burden. So how do we get that message out there? If you can answer the question either from a personal perspective or examples of folks that you've worked with who have taught the businesses that this is a good thing, because this is, I'll give you a quick analogy. When we talk about captioning a Zoom class for our students on campus, so they have the access to what is being said by everybody. It doesn't just benefit the students who need that as an accommodation, but being at a university, we have students who are international, who English is not their first language. And apologies to those who love the language of English. It's one of the most difficult language to learn as a second language for most of our students coming in. So having that access, and I use that term broadly here, for everybody is a form of universal design, as opposed to just an accommodation. So how do we help employers understand this?
Well, I think it helps to have more case studies, Karen, with real data. If you look at Walgreens, you know, they had a senior vice president, Randy Lewis, who had a son on the autism spectrum. He was in charge of their distribution centers, and they were building a brand new distribution center in Anderson, South Carolina. And he convinced everybody he needed to convince to set a goal that 40% of the workers would be people with any type of disability. And he had no idea how they were going to accomplish the goal, but they embraced the goal. They found partners on the ground and they met the goal. And that distribution center had a culture where whatever people needed, they got. And it had better metrics than any other distribution center in the country. They had better productivity, less absenteeism. Every metric that Walgreens cared about, that
Customer
distribution
service.
center outperformed. So then they built another one in Connecticut, in Windsor, Connecticut. And again, that one had 50% of their employees were people with disabilities, and they outperformed all the other distribution centers. So we need more case studies like that. I think if we can find employers who are willing to lead and then willing to document the business value of what they did, then other employers are going to be more motivated.
I agree. And
Can you also
I
touch
saw
on,
him
Gary, let me,
speak.
Gary, let me
I'm sorry.
interrupt. You want to
Don't
take
worry.
this, take that frame and build from there as well. I agree, case studies, direct examples of their peers who have made this work is super important. It's the way to impress and possibly have, I think someone mentioned in the chat somewhere about competition between the states for legislation that comes through. No one wants to be left behind. When we talk about it from that angle with that, there's still a pushback about what they consider to be an unreasonable request or a costly request. And so they want to throw out the concept of burden. If you can also include that in your responses, because that's where employers think, again, how much is it going to cost me? We're so much, we've learned, particularly with technology, there are so many great tools online that folks can use to access material that are relatively inexpensive, if not free.
Excellent.
I think
Okay. Go, Christy.
I think it just goes beyond the dollars. Okay, so a lot of companies, they depend on these metrics. You know, I get it. You know, everybody wants numbers. They want the business case to be about numbers. But at the end of the day, really, if a company wants to compete in industry or wherever within the university system, that wherever, to be able to attract the talent that would help them to be and become a very high performing company, then they need to start to think about implementing universal design that will be accessible to everyone. They need to have a robust accommodation and accessibility center that's funded, centrally funded. So wherever you're located, you can just go in. It has to be transparent. People need to know where to go. Storytelling is important. It's really important to, the metrics are good, that one thing, but hearing personal stories, lived experiences of disability is really, really impactful. And the more we see that, the more inspired people become, and like, oh, well, if she can, or he can, or they can disclose and share their story, then no, why can't I? So I think it's really from the business standpoint, you want to do whatever you can to make sure that you are able to maintain your competition and standing in the industry by making sure that you have the kind of culture that these talents would want to come to you. So that's my thought.
I say, let's just break this down. The General Motors back in the 80s and 90s pursued a structure of focus on cost to increase profits, and they almost lost the entire automobile market to the Japanese. If you look at automobile companies right now, the focus is on technology capability, and they can charge more. So a business case can be made. Here's another example. The hybrid work right now today has then forced us to keep people out of these silos of a specific job that they do. So the concept of doing pieces of jobs is not a foreign approach. If wrap around that the case studies that shows that the numbers are being gotten, because Christine, with all due respect, if you're dealing with the accountants, numbers are there. They're important. You have to make the numbers work. You have to show that the investment is going to achieve results. In the example with the Walgreens, I met that guy in Michigan. He spoke to us in Michigan up in Lansing. He's very impressive, but he got the numbers. And it's not just the customer service numbers. It's not just the goodwill numbers, right? It's also the numbers on the bottom line, right? Those bottom line numbers buoyed his case. They didn't know what was going to happen. But at the end of the day, his conclusion was he got the dollars. And I think these things can be done because there's lots of tools at our disposal. We're just not employing them. And that's where I think government can play a role. Government can play a role. If we subsidize other industries, why would we not subsidize the type of equipment, training that individuals need to really, truly be effective? If what you're trying to do is employ all Americans. I just think that is the throughway. And I agree with you, Christine, that yes, storytelling is even more powerful when the people telling the stories are your work colleagues. We have to be ambassadors. Those of us that are in companies that are not disclosing must be ambassadors. That's how it works. Every client that I had, once I lost my vision, I spoke to a group of managers about how I navigated getting from my home to the airport, from my airport to the hotel, from my hotel to the client site, and what tools I use to be just as effective on their project, paying me the money they needed to pay me to do that job. That's what opens it up. That is what will open it up. And I think it will have a strong impact if done well. And I think it's happening. I actually think it's happening. Just not maybe happening as fast as we all want it to happen. But that would be my thought. That's how you address the cost game, because you make it, you take it out of the risk area in finance, right? The risk guys, you take it away from them in the regulatory guys, and you put it in the hands of the PR guys and the sales guys and the technologists.
Yeah, I know, but I think it's really difficult, Gary, to quantify what the benefits are in terms of hiring people with disabilities to your company. So let's say in the pharmaceutical industry, where we get our sales is from the sales of our products and from the sales of our drugs. So to be the first on the market with the drug, and you have the upper hand, and you'll be able to make quite a bit of money. Take the COVID, the vaccine, for example, right? So being first on the market has its benefits. So what does it take? I mean, if the company was made up of like-minded people, will we get there? Or do we need, we were trying to emphasize that diversity in thought, diversity in innovation, diversity in processes is what it takes to be able to compete in this industry. And so that means diversity, including people with disabilities, because that is what we're trying to emphasize that don't limit your diversity to just race, gender, underrepresented minorities. Make sure that we include the disabilities as part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion marketing. So I think at the end of the day, it's all about how much money and how many drugs you can sell.
Agreed. Agreed.
Christina, this is Andy. I guess if I were trying to make the business case to Pfizer, I would point them to what Verizon learned. They were studying what would make people feel better about their brand. They were concerned about their brand, and they wanted customers to want to choose them because they like their brand. And they found one of the biggest things that made people feel better about the Verizon brand was their commitment to hiring people with disabilities. I think Pfizer has the same issue. The drug companies are not well loved in this country right now. They have a brand problem. And if they can show that they have an authentic commitment to hiring people with disabilities in the company and tell that story in a compelling way, it could improve the image, not just of the Pfizer brand, but of the whole pharmaceutical industry. So I think there's ways to make the business case, that aren't simply about, more productivity. Karen, you asked, how do we get companies to take another look at spending money in some of these areas? I think it's really important to show the benefit to all employees and not just to employees with disabilities. If you talk to Randy Lewis from Walgreens and the other folks that followed his example, I had a chance to ask a bunch of them. He has a meeting in Indiana periodically with other people who run distribution centers. And I had a chance to ask a bunch of them, what's your strongest reason for hiring a bunch of people with disabilities at your distribution centers? And they all said employee engagement. And I said, what do you mean? And the guy from Public Supermarket said, because we hire people with disabilities, our employees are more likely to shop at Publix, and they're more likely to tell other people to apply for jobs at Publix, and they're less likely to leave. So that's a business value to the company that goes beyond whatever value they're getting from accommodating their own employees with disabilities.
Exactly. I have some students that we do an online store project we're doing this summer. And we were talking about how do we sell these mugs? We can buy mugs anywhere. You have to understand why the people buy what your product is. If you understand it, and that's why I mentioned PR before, it's not nothing. PR is very important. I was in the Disability Inc. conference last week with some of you on the call. And listen, there were some of the companies that I thought were really leaning into it and really doing some innovative things. And there were other companies that were shrugging their shoulders and didn't know how. But Nike was real big on this. They're leaning into it. There are companies that understand this and they are leveraging it. And I think that it's a different play depending on what the company is, right? I think that goes into it, right? There's a lot of engagement person to person when you're dealing with Walgreens, right? Less so because Pfizer's not directly customer facing, which is why they can get the feeling of people. Well, I took a Pfizer shot, and I'm glad because I'm not sick, so I'm down with Pfizer, but I can see where that comes from because it's not customer facing, and that's where what you were saying earlier really has a greater impact. Let's remember that this new generation, these generations coming up, they live on media. They live on social media and what people's images are, and being able to harness that and leverage it is a force multiplier. As I say, the automotive companies in Michigan are not talking about their manufacturing processes. They're talking about their technology ingenuity. That takes investment, that takes money that is worth investing because people will buy your product, right? That is a business approach to getting something done. And I think that's the only thing that gets it done in any large way in this country.
So who mentioned that? Somebody mentioned that, I know pharmaceutical companies are not well liked in the country. Was that you, Andy? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so, I mean, yeah, we get it. So it's, so thinking about what we need to do is, so we're also working on expanding our supply of diversity to include disability-owned businesses. So we're trying to, in that space, trying to repair the public image. We're trying to, support disability-owned businesses. We're trying to support talent with disabilities in the company. We're trying to support candidates with disabilities that want to come to the company. So, we have a ways to go, but like anybody else, we're on a journey and we're trying. But I do want to mention, Andy, thank you for bringing up the Randy's book. Randy, he has a book, and I highly recommend you read it. I met Randy Lewis a couple of years ago in New York City, and I actually sat next to him at a group dinner, and
Oh, wow.
fabulous, fabulous. I was just awestruck by his energy and his passion, and it was amazing. So I highly recommend everybody read his book.
Christy, if you can drop the name of who you're speaking about, Randy, his last name and the name of the book in the chat, so we have that for everyone else. Appreciate that, because I think you've sparked some interest in that for everyone
Oh,
else.
he's very impressive. Yeah, I like the way she said that. His energy is contagious. It really is. And his son, I believe his son is on the spectrum, but he's awesome.
Thank you for that. So another question, I hate to bring this question up because we've had such a positive view on ideas and sharing our information, but litigation. We hear about it. There are a lot of court decisions. We kind of talked about it before with some of the decisions on the ADA. How does it help or hurt potential employees?
I guess I'll take a crack at that. Certainly the employees who win damage claims are helped somewhat. I mean, they get compensated when they're wrong, and this is quite often straight disability discrimination, and it's still going on, and there's still major corporations engaging in it. And, so they get some compensation, and then it kind of fits in with things we've talked about, and they kind of can become advocates and spokespeople and say, I had this experience, and they find more not to overuse the word, but accommodating employers or employers who are willing to have them. So that is happening. The EEOC has gotten some good settlements lately. I have noticed, we were talking about the federal courts, in my space, which is the employment law space, the discrimination laws are the ones that the federal judges are so far, and almost, I looked for state claims, at least in Maryland, there are hardly any. Almost all the action is in the federal courts, at least in the East, it's in the federal courts. What was I saying? So they are still taking discrimination seriously. They don't want to be accused of being racist or anti-disability or any number of things. They're not going as far as probably many people on this call would want, but they're at least ruling in favor of plaintiffs who bring disability claims. And again, I only use the term disability because that's the term in the law. So I know there can be controversy around that term. So that's the good. The bad is you have to get a lawyer, basically, and not everybody can get a lawyer. And the federal courts, Mark Rosemore says they're stacked with right-wing judges, but that's my point, Mark, is wage and hour you lose before these judges, privacy claims you lose, but the discrimination claims are the ones, at least so far, that they're willing to take seriously all the way up to the appellate level. I don't know if that'll change. It could, but I have been following it, and so far, it's held, but basically you have to get a lawyer. Not everybody can get a lawyer. That's where groups, various advocacy groups can come in and be helpful. But, it takes a long time, and we prefer to find another means of providing for people who have been wronged in this way. So that's my contribution.
So from my own personal experience, I would say the following, that with the nebulous language of accommodations, right? And the laws that are all over this country at will, making a discrimination case if you're one individual that is faced with that, is daunting. For me personally, when I was losing my vision, I invested in the equipment that would make it more effective for me to work in my job. I did not go to the state. I did not go to an attorney, but being an employer myself and a person that has been bumping around corporate America at large for most of my career, I knew a win was coming and I needed to make a decision. And it was just a straightforward calculation. Will me filing some type of action against the company, which I will not name, would that hurt me or help me in pursuit of other business in the industry that is pretty insular? I concluded that I would do myself harm, not good, right? It was tempered with my innate desire and ability to know that I'm going to hustle and find a way to figure it out. And I've never been afraid of losing a job, but that's just one guy. That's just one guy with one attitude. That was my calculation. I believe I had a cause of action, right? I was a highly, highly effective consultant, highly profitable for the firm. But they have right rules. They can say goodbye to me anytime they want. So am I gonna mount that fight, or am I going to recognize the reality of the situation and make a change? I mean, that was my calculation. And I may have had the means to seek legal assistance, but I didn't think it was the best hedge. I didn't think it was the best investment for me. Much too risky at this age, or at that time, I was 57 years old. I had to consider all those things. Mm-hmm. So that's a real experience.
Yeah, I would just add, I think it being a plaintiff in a case where you're alleging discrimination against yourself can be incredibly psychically draining. It's, it can be financially draining, but also can drain your spirit. So, I mean, there are lots of reasons to try to resolve these things without litigation. And I think it's important to recognize that the law gives you power that you can use without having to go to a court. So I don't want people to think that because litigation is not a great strategy, it doesn't mean the law is not helpful or important in the workplace.
Yeah, I can dig it. I can dig it.
And we've seen over the past few years, the Office of Civil Rights, when they get a grievance from a student, since again, my field is education, that they want to work towards mediation first before they open up an investigation. So I'm hoping that that mediation continues because it is a lot less difficult for both parties to be involved with that, and hopefully people walk away with an outcome that's agreeable, as well as learning something, a takeaway that they have, as opposed to just fighting the battles.
Yeah.
Christy, you were going to say something? I'm sorry.
Yes, I was going to say that I'm sorry. I was researching the title of Randy's book, so I never heard the actual question.
We're talking about possible litigation being beneficial or not beneficial for potential employees.
Oh, well, okay. So I've always suspected that I've been discriminated for a long time, trying to find my first job, especially after getting my master's. And the longer it took, the more discouraged I got. And so it was a very long journey to finally get my job with a company like Pfizer. And when I think about even the discrimination, the incidences I can think of, that there's a number of factors that I think about. Is I'm not like Gary. I do care about being let go, so I don't want to. I didn't want to fight. I wasn't prepared to lose my job and then have to go through all that all over again. So it wasn't really an option for me. Although if somebody would have come along and said, you know what, I'll take your case for free, and I will push hard, and I will, take you through the court and, advocate for you. Maybe I would have taken up that. I just wasn't, this was just something I just do want to consider.
That's real.
Okay, so I'm looking at the time and we have about 20 minutes before we start to really wrap this up. And so my last question for the panel really is, what are the next steps all of us or anyone can take to increase the number of people with disabilities in the workforce? So basically your parting thoughts on the conversation we've been having.
Okay. I don't mind. I operate in this space for exactly that answer. Be that middle piece that connects what's happening in the state organizations, in the educational institutions like yours, Karen. Keep a foot in the corporate world that Christine lives in. Marry the two with realism. That is how you accelerate. That is how you integrate. That is how you get more people with disabilities into businesses. Make the case to the businesses on the business side. Help the state organizations by identifying the type of training that they do not currently fully appreciate or provide to those individuals, and make the business case to the companies like any other management consultant that ever lived. I'm taking all of those experiences that I have gained as a consultant and an entrepreneur and an employer, and I'm trying to bang it into programs that feed the corporations like Pfizer and others the type of talent that will get the job done, thus opening up other opportunities for others. That's how you do it. I'm playing in that space because I think it is the most expedient to get it done. I yield the floor.
Yeah, that's a hard act to follow, Gary. So I would say be a champion, be an advocate, be an ambassador, as Gary says. Do anything you can and try to reach out and talk to people in companies, talk to them about people with disabilities, educate them. Maybe try to bring in guest speakers or something just to raise the bar a little bit in knowledge, bring in disability etiquette, training sessions, disability awareness, anything just to just emphasize that. Share stories to storytelling, encourage people to self-identify.
Right.
From the corporate level, the business case needs to be made by creating a culture where people feel that they can trust that the information they shared will be valued, it will be protected. But if they share their stories, then more people will be inclined to self-identify, which will make the business case for a lot of the things that we talked about today. So just keep talking, just hang in there, keep pushing, keep talking.
I'll just interject, and Gary did reference it earlier, but it's understandable with such a distinguished guest from Pfizer being one of the panelists, but a lot of discussion of corporations, General Motors, but a lot, small and medium-sized businesses too. And in fact, many of them are having more difficulty hiring than a lot of corporations. And so I think a real case can be made to them, because then the public relations, the customer relations, the local news coverage in some places could really, really be beneficial to such companies. So I just wanted to make that.
That is an excellent point. But just before we go to the last speaker, I just want to throw this in. I did attend a session here in the state of Michigan where we had those mid-range employees and talk about how they can integrate people with disabilities. And there was a lot of resistance in that room on the cost issue, right? Because now that whole investment concept is much different if I'm a company of 200 people versus one of 250,000 people.
And this is Annie. I would just add that in my experience, disability is such a big, broad category that we have allies in every place, whether it's a small business, a large business, a medium-sized business, a law school, you know, a university. So I think part of our job is to identify allies and leverage our allies to try to build a more inclusive culture. And I would say to always push ourselves to ask who's not represented in this group, who are the groups that may have the most difficulty having success in this organization, and are we willing to really think hard about how to make this an accessible and welcoming work environment for everyone. And I think starting with your allies and then trying to make your circle go broader over time is a good strategy, whether you're working for a small employer or a really large employer.
Agree.
Agreed.
Thank you. So we have about now 15 minutes left. I appreciate the information the panelists have shared. I'd like to open the floor for any questions that you haven't asked our panelists, either in the chat or that are on your mind now that you want to make sure you get answered. So I open up the floor to anyone else. Please either raise your hand with the raise a hand or just, you know, go ahead and ask.
Are there any questions in the chat specifically for any of us panelists?
I read one that we just received from Christian Gamble. Although ADA prevents employers from discriminating against disabled individuals by prohibiting them from choosing the disability as to why they do not give the individual the job, there seems to be more of a stigma against particularly visually impaired individuals for visually creative technical positions. How could perspectives be shifted in a way to allow truly equal opportunities? Great question.
Great guy.
And Gary, is that for you?
Oh, was that one for me? No, I'm not the lawyer in the room. I'm just the cat trying to get people employed.
I'd like to take a stab at answering this one because this one sounds like it's coming from, as Gary talked about earlier, making those connections early from students in a particular program, this one being a visual creative art program. The student has a visually a visual based disability, and they want to go into the field that they're studying for. We have a couple of programs at our university that are very visually based, and we've had students in those programs with a diagnosis that is visually based. And when they are working with our career center folks, we have career counselors designated per college. And in our office, we talk about the translation of their classroom accommodations to the workforce. Some of them are not translatable, like exam accommodations, because hopefully once you're done, you don't have to take any more tests. We talk about also, how did you access content? What were the tools that we utilized during the course of the time? And in those programs, they develop portfolios of work completed. So you're being hired on the skill sets that you bring to the position. So that's part of what we do from our end of it, and to connect the students with the opportunities they have now been fully prepared for. I don't know if any of the other panels or anyone else
Karen,
in the room can address that.
You went right to where I want to go. First of all, let me just say, in the energy industry specifically, they do continue to take tests. And the same types of accommodations do need to exist within said corporations, right? If you're in the engineering, if you're in a plant, if you're anywhere around chemicals, I'm sure Christine will support me on this. There has to be education that occurs, and continuous education just to stay in alignment with OSHA. So that is one of those skills. The issue in the real question is the skill, the accommodation portfolio that they're building in the university doesn't really address the work issues that the student is going to face after transition. And I go back to my closing statement. That voice is not heard in the halls of education. That voice is not heard in the rehabilitation community. That's the problem. So the connection is not being made. So either there's more investment in these middle organizations, or you have to include those types of individuals in the state organization that do build these people up from the beginning to the end of their education. They have to come, just like anybody, just like any protected class has to come out of that education system ready to employ. And to the extent that those few do that, others will follow. I'm completely convinced of it. I'm a Black guy living in America from 1959 to now. I've seen it happen in the course of my own life.
So Gary, I wanted to say that so students with low vision and blindness, students that were looking for jobs in industry and they rely on accessibility tools, for instance, the employer doesn't really know a whole lot about them. So for one thing, I think I highly recommend students and companies companies in particular, to really consider hiring a student intern, whether it's for a short summer, because those kind of experiences are good, not just for the student, but also for the employer, the group,
Excellent.
for the managers, because it gives them and it teaches them, it educates them about what the individual will need. Now, and I think you mentioned, Andy, that, or maybe it was Michael, larger companies, they do have the money to provide it, but for the smaller ones, if they need some financial assistance for accommodations, I believe, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, the student with a disability can go through the state and request accommodations and they get paid for by the state, right?
Some states, yes, some states not. The state laws are varied.
Mhm.
From what I know what happens in Michigan, because I live here, but I have talked to other individuals from other states, and I was completely flummoxed by how broadly this can swing and what the state will do or is willing to do to support. I mean, I have a candidate that I, as his advocate, talked to the IT people because he didn't know how to talk to the IT people, communicated to them what the accommodation might be, talked to the state and how they might help. The state said yes, but I think if I had that same conversation in another state, I might have gotten a different answer.
Yeah. Though in this administration, there might be some federal
Yeah.
help too.
I know there's three bills that were in the House of Representatives for, I don't know, the last 2.5 years. I don't know if they've gotten any juice and to be turned into law. Reimbursements for buying your own equipment was one of them. I can't remember the name of the legislation. I wish I was better prepared. My kids are going to kill me for this, but that would have been nice to put into the chat. There were three pieces of legislation around making it equipment more accessible, more reachable for the customer, regardless of what the state is willing to do or not do.
But I think the point is that we're trying to minimize barriers to hiring and not have the companies use the cost as a barrier to hiring
Agreed.
talent with disabilities. So
I completely agree.
use educate, use vocational rehabilitation, for lack of a better word, but use them to talk to the employers, tell them what options are available to them with respect to getting the accommodation that they need to support their employee. So I think there's a lot that can be done there. The company just have to be willing to do it.
And Karen, just quickly, the question asked about visually creative or technical positions. And I think one of the things I would emphasize is somebody who's low vision or blind is going to be creative by necessity in a visual context. They're going to think differently about the assignment. They're going to come up with ideas that other people may not come up with. So, I mean, to me, the best way to change attitudes in an industry like that is show people what you can do.
Yes.
You're-
And
you're
that
working
dovetails in what
for
Christine
yourself.
was saying.
Yeah.
That dovetails exactly into what Christine was saying. And a way to do that is for these students to actually have access to what I call traditional corporate internships. What I found to be true in many instances is that the organization that Karen is in is not always talking to the organization that does the college recruiting and internships for students. They're not even getting access to that. And to the extent that they do get access, the very thing that Christine's talking about is when these students are engaging in these corporations of any size, pick your size, when they're engaging one-on-one in these situations and they're solving those problems and they're doing that work, that spreads the world, that raises the possibilities. So there's got to be more of that. And I think that is driven by either changing the character of the types of people that are in these state organizations or engaging with companies that are willing to fill that space. I mean, I'm a capitalist, I'm an entrepreneur, and entrepreneurs solve problems. That's how we make money. I saw this problem existing in my own experience, and that's why my company exists. It's going to be that kind of thing that will change the story, because I hire people with disabilities. It's my people that are sighted that have the disability in my company. Right? That's changes the game, in my way of thinking.
Excellent points. I just want to point out there's another hand.
Yes, thank you.
And by the way, I don't think law has it. I think what they said is all the way to do it. I don't think law would be too helpful, at least at this point in history right now. Go ahead.
We have a question from the audience. Elizabeth Argant. Elizabeth, do you want to ask a question?
Her audio may not be working.
Or maybe she just raised her hand to say, I have a nice tie on.
Maybe she could put the question in the chat.
I don't see anything in the chat for that, but there's a question.
Elizabeth raised her hand, but
yes.
I don't know what's going on.
Okay, so there's one last question that was kind of discussed during the last few minutes that Mark put down in regards to the labor shortage and why the labor shortage in and of itself hasn't led to increased employment of people with disabilities. Anyone want to take a quick stab at that? Because that probably could take another couple of hours in regards to all the stuff we've been bringing up.
Well, there has been some modest improvement in labor force participation rates for people with disabilities based on the imperfect data we get from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But I think the reason we haven't seen transformational change there, or one reason, Mark, I believe, is that we haven't fundamentally changed our disability benefit programs. We still
100%.
have a definition of disability that was written in 1956 that equates 100%. A diagnosis and a medical doctor's opinion with inability to work. So I really feel like until we make disability benefits dramatically more work-friendly, we're going to have much lower labor force participation rates than should be possible. People should get support from the government to help them participate in the labor force, and the support should wrap around their labor force participation, but it shouldn't force people to prove that they can't work in order to get support from the government, which is what our system still does.
That is where it hurts. Exactly right. And part of it is the talent themselves. It's part of it, not all of it, not all of it. Part of it is the talent believing that they can achieve. If I'm getting a benefit from the state to just stay at home, and the job that I'm being offered gives me that same amount, most people in this country would take that bet. Most people would. There has to be an incentive to work. I don't just work just to build my ego. I work to make money, to buy what my wife likes and to buy what I like. That's why I work, right? So my point is that there has to be the resilience of the candidates as well, from the choices that they make in high school through college, especially with a lot of their educations being provided, which is dangerous, right? If it's provided, you may make a choice differently than, let's say, a guy from the inner city Detroit. I made a decision that would get me paid. That's the decision I made. That was part of it, right? So that thinking is part of it as well, because that's the downside of any civil rights legislation. It's the defining of the protected class, and the country builds this paternalistic attitude about it, and that can be hurtful. That can drown people out, and that's what we have to fix. I think that is part of it, the talent themselves. That's controversial. I would not like to leave on that note. So hopefully Christine is going to say something much more uplifting.
No, I was just thinking about but Gary, you and I had this conversation in Dallas last week about people would rather stay home, and it has to do with the subminimum wage, really. So until that changes, the benefits in the government are going to be higher. So I think there needs to be something why the government needs to change, realize that this is expensive to keep people at home. Why don't you let the companies pay for their wages so that they don't have to collect all of these benefits? I don't know. That's not uplifting at all. I'm sorry.
No, it's uplifting because, listen, we're having the conversation, right? All these people in this room, the four of us, this is what needs to continue to happen. Solutions, engagement, and pushing, having all the voices mixed together. This is why I love Pieces of Me. It's all of us have a voice at the table. Our board meetings are very, very intense. Lots of opinions, lots of back and forth. But I think when you do that, you always get a better outcome. And that's what I'm about. I'm about better outcomes. I've learned some things tonight, and I hope that you guys have learned some things as well. How's that?
That's awesome. I love that ending. So what I'd like to do now is to thank our panelists for their information. I have learned a lot. I am a rabid note taker, so I've been taking notes when I can between the questions and answers. And I'd like to turn it over to our fabulous intern, Mukaya Saad, for some final notes.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to say thank you for our panelists, our interpreters, and our amazing audience. My name is Rukaya Fayyad, and I'm the latest intern at Pieces of Me. This internship is coming to an end, and I'm very thankful that I joined this organization and been part of their mission. I learned so many things that I will keep with me for the future. I learned how to communicate well with others and get better at professional writing. Also, this internship made me love working with others and learning about their story and their mission. Pieces of Me is all about creating opportunity so that we can fulfill our potential. Next month, Pieces of Me will be covering higher education. For more information regarding future events and how you can support our organization, please visit us at www.piecesofme.org. We also encourage you to join our social media communities, including our new Facebook group. Thank you and have a great evening.
All right, right on.
Okay, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We look forward to having you at any of our future events.
Take care. It was
Gentlemen,
awesome.
it was great meeting you. Christine, thank you very much.
You too.
Great to
Hope
meet you
you
all.
stay
Thank you.
connected somehow.
Participating.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Okay, take care.